Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to rise today to discuss S-232, Jewish Heritage Month, and I want to recognize the work of my friend, the MP from York Centre, and Senator Frum for her work with respect to bringing this to Parliament, to recognize Jewish Heritage Month, and more specifically, to recognize the important contributions that Jewish Canadians have made to Canada's social, economic, political, and cultural fabric, and to remember, celebrate, and educate Canadians about that contribution. Now, you might say, why is an Irish Catholic MP from Ontario rising on this? Because, Mr. Speaker, I've seen firsthand throughout my own life, and certainly in my passion for political life, for really my adult life, the critical contribution of Jewish Canadians to the Canada we all enjoy today. And so I will speak to that. Much like my father, John O'Toole, as an MPP in the Ontario Legislature, Mr. Speaker, introduced a bill to recognize Irish Heritage Day. I think the fabric, the tapestry of Canada is made better when we celebrate and acknowledge what produced it. A cross-section of people who have come here for the tremendous opportunity that Canada represents. The opportunity for them or their children to form critical parts of our political, cultural, social history, Mr. Speaker. So I want to congratulate my friend from across the way and my good friend from the Senate for bringing this today. I also want to recognize a very important person in my life, my late uncle Paul Goodman, for educating me on Jewish traditions, for allowing me to join them for Passover and a number of special celebrations for the community, and as my first relative to really challenge me to think about the world and Canada's place in it. I'm thinking of him as I stand here today, and my Aunt Jane, who remains a very important part of my life. First, I think all parliamentarians have to have great respect for Herb Gray, the first Jewish cabinet minister from the Liberal Party who became a cabinet member in 1969, and by the time he left Parliament was the longest-serving parliamentarian, Mr. Speaker. The grey fog, as someone reminded us, who was very effective at dispersing any criticism of the Chrétien government because he would get up and just dispel the grey fog to much effect. I had the personal privilege, Mr. Speaker, of helping organize a dinner in Toronto a decade ago with the Churchill Society for the Advancement of Parliamentary Democracy to celebrate him as our Churchill Award winner, Mr. Speaker, for his tremendous contributions to our parliamentary democracy, Mr. Speaker. I think his impact is still felt in this place, and I'm sure I can say that my friend from York Centre probably draws some inspiration from the life of Mr. Gray. At that dinner, Mr. Speaker, as I said, this is how it's impacted the Irish Catholic kid from Southern Ontario. I got to meet a hero of mine, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Barney Danson, who was the first Jewish defense minister in Canadian history, and very appropriately so, Mr. Speaker, because he was a veteran of the Normandy landings and fought with the Queen's Own Rifles, our oldest regiment, Mr. Speaker, in continuous service, and I just happened to be in their armories last week as part of the Invictus Games, Mr. Speaker. And to have storied veterans like Mr. Danson serve with that regiment, I think makes that regiment and our country better. And he returned to Canada like many veterans from World War II, injured, with loss of vision in an eye. But you didn't see it impact his business career and certainly his remarkable public service as an MP and as a defense minister who understood the file from having worn the uniform of his country, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's important for me to say, as a Conservative MP, how proud I am that two parliamentarians, Senator Frum and the MP from York Centre, are bringing this forward, because the history of the Jewish community, of course, like all Canadians, is not confined to the Liberal, PC, Conservative or NDP parties. I had the honour of meeting Larry Grossman, Mr. Speaker, before he died far too young, an MPP in the Ontario Legislature and the first Jewish leader of the PC Party of Ontario. He assumed that mantle in 1985, Mr. Speaker. And of course, this Parliament saw David Lewis, leader of the New Democratic Party, Mr. Speaker, in 1971. Last week, I joined many from the business community at the launch of Nuit Blanche at Toronto City Hall. And where did we see that exhibit, Mr. Speaker? Of course, in Nathan Phillips Square, the namesake for a very, very important civic leader from Toronto, Mr. Nathan Phillips, a Jewish mayor of that city, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very proud to say in this House, the first leadership vote I cast as a young PC, still in the military at the time, was for my friend Hugh Segal, who was not successful in that leadership bid, kind of like I wasn't successful most recently, Mr. Speaker, but ran with honor and with integrity and with ideas for the future of the country. And I was proud that Prime Minister Martin later appointed him as a Conservative senator to our upper house. We need only look at the wonderful investiture of our new Governor General yesterday to see how the arts community in Canada and around the world reverberates. Perhaps my favorite part was the spectacular rendition of Alleluia yesterday from Leonard Cohen, Mr. Speaker, someone from the Montreal Jewish community. My previous experience with that song was hearing it sung at the opening of the Vancouver Olympics, Mr. Speaker. Now one of the most iconic and covered songs in the world with its origins in Montreal. Also out of Montreal, another contributor to the arts community, one of my favorite actors, William Shatner, Mr. Speaker. We were investing an astronaut as our Governor General. Well, who was the first space traveler we all looked to but Canada's own William Shatner? And I remembered when preparing for this speech, Mr. Speaker, my send-off to my friend Arnold Chan, who passed and left this House and left us, was an exchange on Mr. Nimoy and Mr. Shatner's famous Star Trek line, "I have been and shall always be your friend," Mr. Speaker. I was glad to see the Prime Minister also use that when he eulogized our friend Arnold. So certainly that iconic friendship was from a Canadian Jewish actor and an American Jewish actor, Mr. Speaker, and it resonates with me still to this day. How else has it affected me? The tremendous business success that some members of the Jewish community have enjoyed has often led to outstanding, in fact, trailblazing philanthropy, Mr. Speaker. I'm a graduate of the Schulich School of Law, Mr. Speaker, the Dalhousie University Law School. That is just one of 5 schools Mr. Schulich has endowed to make sure that we're educating Canadians, be they here for many years or a few weeks, to give them the tremendous opportunity that many Jewish immigrants had when they came to Canada to have success in this country, Mr. Speaker. So indeed, culturally, politically, from a philanthropic and business standpoint, you can't look around modern Canada and not see the tremendous impact of Jewish Canadians on our country. And so that's why I'm so happy that my friends have brought this to this place to make sure that we mark that each year with a month for Jewish heritage, Mr. Speaker. I'll end with saying my friends have said this is a celebration, but also important to remember and educate, Mr. Speaker. I think those are critical. I applauded, as my colleagues did today, the Minister of Heritage for getting in this place and saying they will rectify the designation at the Holocaust Memorial, Mr. Speaker. I was proud, alongside my friend from York Centre and others, to condemn the boycott, divest, sanction movement, Mr. Speaker, in this House, where members of Parliament can try to show the creeping edge of anti-Semitism, Mr. Speaker. And if you look at recent statistics, it's still the Jewish community and anti-Semitism that ranks as the highest hate crime in Canada, Mr. Speaker. So as we honor, remember, and celebrate, let's also educate, Mr. Speaker, because I think it's important for Canadians to realize that this form of discrimination, anti-Semitism, exclusion, can still creep into our society, and it must be called out when we see it. And I think parliamentarians have a special duty in that regard, Mr. Speaker, for all types of intolerance. Finally, I think it is important to remember, and I'm glad I've heard by reading the newspaper, that the Prime Minister may honor and remember the merchant ship St. Louis, Mr. Speaker. And we must remember that terrible episode from our past on the one is too many era, Mr. Speaker, where we denied 900 Jews fleeing Europe at a time we should have been opening up to protect them. So we have much to celebrate, Mr. Speaker. I've tried to touch on this, but as my friends have said, celebrate, remember, and educate, and I'm very glad we will be able to do that each year as Canadians, whether Jewish or Irish, to celebrate the tremendous contribution of Jewish Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.